city walls, perhaps the best part to walk if you only want to do a short segment of them, keeping you close to the city's centre attractions and some of our bus stops. The ditch below us on the right is one of the most impressive features of York's medieval defences. A water-filled ditch was constructed in the early 1200s alongside the lengths of wall not protected by the rivers, adding an extra layer of defence. Looking above the buildings on your right, you can see the top of Monk Bar, York's tallest gateway. You will get a better view of the whole tower if you keep looking right when we pass through the junction. 4 stories high, Monk Bar was largely built in the 1300s, though the upper level was added later in the 1400s. Monk Bar has the only working portcullis of any of the city's entranceways, a gate that could be lowered when the city was under threat. The bar contains murder holes still visible in the structure, which allowed defenders to throw missiles and debris onto attacking forces. On top of Monk Bar's battlements, you can see the stone figures known as the Wild Men of York. Local legend says they will come alive if the city is attacked and drop their boulders onto the enemy. York was last besieged during the English Civil War of 1644, when the city was captured by parliamentarian forces.
If you glance to the right as we go along Monkgate, we'll reach a gap leading to a large red brick building, the Victorian County Hospital. Initially established in a different building on Monkgate in 1740, it was a voluntary hospital, supported by subscriptions from the wealthy to treat the poor for free. In the early 1850s, a new purpose-built hospital replaced the older building and was in use until 1977. It's also notable for one of the earliest known hospital radio stations. The building was converted into luxury apartments in the 1990s. One of the most important 18th century artists, George Stubbs, studied human anatomy at York County Hospital under the surgeon Charles Atkinson. Stubbs spent 6 years in the city, supporting himself by painting portraits of the gentry. It was a crucial time for the young artist's development. Arguably, the most famous painting by Stubbs is Whistle Jacket, commissioned by the second Marquess of Rockingham, which is probably the most well-known portrait of a horse.
Below you on the left-hand side runs the River Foss, the smaller of York's 2 rivers. The Foss meets up with the larger river, the Ouse, just south of the city centre. From there, the water flows into the Humber Estuary and the North Sea. For most of York's history, people have used the rivers for trade and industry. The Romans used York's rivers to import exotic goods from the rest of the empire, like olive oil, figs, pottery and wine. Trade with Europe continued through the Anglo-Saxon, Viking and medieval periods. In the Industrial Revolution, the areas by the River Foss were developed, and an early Victorian gasworks were built around the site of the supermarkets on the right.
Look to your right now and you will see that the city wall suddenly comes to an end in this area. No stone defences were needed on this side of York because of the King's Fish Pool, a huge marshy lake that covered much of the area ahead of us. To get to the next section of the city walls, walk alongside the River Foss on Foss Islands Road. Stay on the road when the river turns away and past the retail park. After a few minutes you will come to the Red Tower, where you can rejoin the walls. York, like other medieval settlements, was never completely surrounded by stone walls, as there was no need for fortifications where water provided a defence against attack. In the 11th century, the Normans created the King's Fish Pool by damming the River Foss at a point close to York Castle. As well as creating a natural defence to the east of the city, the water filled the ditches of the newly built castle, constructed on the orders of King William the Conqueror. The large artificial lake remained for about 800 years, though it gradually decreased in size and depth over time, leaving marshy islands, which gave their name to the nearby Foss Islands Road. York Corporation purchased the land in the 1850s, which was then drained, and various industries were established in the area.
is St Cuthbert's Church, one of the oldest churches in York, mentioned in the Domesday Book of 1086. Most of the church was rebuilt in the middle of the 1400s, perhaps by William Bowes, a former mayor of York. His descendant, Sir Martin Bowes, was keen to preserve St Cuthbert's when the church faced demolition, and wrote to the city authorities in 1547, asking them to save it. Members of the local Thompson family worshipped in the church, whose later descendants included General James Wolfe, leader of the British attack on Quebec in 1759. Wolfe was mortally wounded in that battle, but it was a victory for his forces, leading to Canada becoming part of the British Empire.
On the left is the Black Swan pub, dating back to the early 1400s. It was originally constructed as a private residence for William Bowes, a merchant and Sheriff of York in 1417, who later became Lord Mayor. Later residents include the parents of General James Wolfe, who led the victorious attack on Quebec in 1759. Inside the pub is a warren of alleyways and a number of beautifully panelled rooms, many with low ceilings and beams. Not surprisingly, with such an old building, the pub is said to be haunted by a number of ghosts, including a workman in a bowler hat, and a young woman in a long white dress seen gazing into the fireplace. We are now at our most central bus stop. From here it is just a short distance to the shops, the markets, and the famous street The Shambles. Also nearby are fabulous tourist attractions, including the York Viking Centre, the Merchant Adventurers Hall, and the Roman Bath Museum. The next street on the right leads to city centre shops clustered around King's Square, where you'll also find York's chocolate story. There are also many wonderful places to shop and eat along the next few streets on our left-hand side. You can also catch our coastliner bus nearby, which stops in York on its journeys between Leeds and the East Coast. Please ask your driver for more information.
On your right is a little street with a very odd name, Whitmer Gate. See if you can spot the street sign on the low church wall on the right when we go past. It was first mentioned in 1505 as Whitnor Gate. Just 32 metres long, it is the shortest street in the city, but with the longest name. Nobody is certain of the true explanation for the name, but the most common explanation is that it means neither one thing nor another. See the Shambles, in the little gap after the church at the corner of Marks and Spencer. This is York's most famous street, first recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086. The Shambles is one of our top places to see and go shopping, the iconic cobbled street of medieval buildings.
On your left, where Pizza Hut is now, is 28 Pavement. This was where in 1822 Joseph Rowntree from Scarborough had a grocer's shop, which later grew into a famous chocolate business. In this building, Rowntree held Quaker meetings, built up his business, brought up his family, and trained apprentices. George Cadbury was apprenticed here in the 1850s, working alongside Joseph Rowntree Jr.
Just down the next street on the left is the York Viking Centre. York Archaeological Trust carried out excavations in the area between 1976 and 1981, before the planned construction of the Coppergate Shopping Centre. Long ago, the Coppergate area was central to the Viking city of Jorvik. The excavations showed evidence of metalworking and the manufacture of wooden cups and bowls, from where Coppergate took its name, the street of the Coppermakers. Around 40,000 archaeological items were discovered, including vast quantities of oyster shells and animal bones.
On your right is the Grand Opera House, built originally as the city's corn exchange. Converted into a theatre, it opened in 1902 with a production of Little it once again became a theatre. There's always a mixture of bands, musicals, plays and comedy schedule, so have a look at what's on whilst you're staying in York.
Stay here. Yeah.
On your left is Clifford's Tower, which is one of the main surviving features of York Castle. If you visit the tower, you can get a wonderful view from the top. This is also a great stop to get off and explore from. Nearby attractions include York Castle Museum, the York Dungeon, Fairfax House, York Valley Museum, as well as the Riverside Promenade and boat cruises. It's also a short walk back to the York Viking Centre and the rest of the city centre shops and attractions.
Soon joined them, which included many who saw a chance to remove their debts to Jewish moneylenders. The Jews were besieged. Outside the castle, the attackers had enough time to build a siege engine. In desperation, the Jews hurled stones down on their attackers. Events came to a head on the 16th of March. The frightened Jews realised they would not be let out alive and chose to commit suicide rather than be killed by the mob. The mass suicide took place against a backdrop of flames as fire consumed the tower. The few who tried to leave the burning castle were murdered by the mob. Afterwards, some of the rioters destroyed records of their debts to the Jews, which had been placed in safekeeping at York Minster. King Richard fined members of the city heavily, but some instigators escaped and fled abroad. The events of 1190 are a dreadful point in York's history. In spring, the mount to our left blooms with thousands of daffodils, planted by local school children and volunteers in memory of the tragic event. In 2023, York gained its first resident rabbi for several centuries.
The area on the left includes buildings added into York Castle in the 1700s. 2 prison buildings, now the York Castle Museum, and a courthouse. Imprisonment and punishment became the main function of York Castle in the 1700s, when most of the older castle buildings were cleared away. The 3 buildings surround a circular lawn known as the Eye of York, where public proclamations were made until the 1800s. The main jail building had 2 purposes. One part was the debtors' prison, where its inmates were held until they were able to settle with their creditors. The other part was the jail, for keeping felons awaiting trial. After several months' confinement, felons could have been sentenced to death or transported to America or Australia, although records show half of those jailed here are actually found not guilty at their trials and set free. If you visit the York Castle Museum, you can see some of the cells, including the one Dick Turpin is held in.
We can now see Fishergate Boston Tower, which will be passing on our right-hand side as we turn around this end section of the city walls. An interesting feature to spot is the long vertical stone shaft sticking out from this side of the tower on the right. This is the guardrail, the medieval toilet. Also look for a small archway. This is the postern, and it once had portcullis. The huge stone tower was built at the start of the 1500s, but it is not the first one to stand on this site. It has 4 floors, linked by a spiral staircase, and is one of the 6 original Boston towers that defended the city.
As we pass the graveyard on your left, you can see the gravestone of Dick Turpin, the infamous highwayman. Please watch out for low-hanging trees on the corner. Turpin's gravestone is the one standing at the back, in the shadow of the trees. He was not from the city, but he was executed in York in 1739. If you would like to visit the graveyard, it is a short walk back from the next bus stop.
Born in Essex, Turpin progressed from stealing deer to highway robbery before being executed in York. If it had not been for William Harrison Ainsworth's popular novel Rookwood, published nearly a century later, Dick Turpin would not have been granted his notorious status. However, he was not the heroic figure of legend. Turpin's early years were spent as a butcher, but He later joined the dangerous Gregory gang, a band of violent housebreakers operating down south in the early 1730s. Accounts tell of how they brutally tortured their victims at gunpoint. One of the few members of the gang to avoid capture, Turpin turned to highway robbery, which soon led to him killing a man in 1737. Turpin escaped to Yorkshire, where he settled in Brook. Having adopted the name John Palmer, Turpin began stealing horses, but his trade was exposed while imprisoned for shooting with buckrolls. Horse thefts were enough for Turpin to be sentenced to death. Once his real identity was uncovered, during his later confinement in the jail at York Castle, Dick Turpin was hanged at York's Knavesmire on the 7th of April, 1739.
If you look ahead of us, you'll be able to see one of the main towers in the city walls, Warngate Bar. This formed the main entrance into York from the southeast, originally probably nothing more than a stone-arched gateway through the timber palisaded earthwork. The original arch, later incorporated into the current bar, dates from the 1100s, although most of the structure is made up of stonework from the 1300s. On the inner side of the entranceway is an extension, supported on stone columns, which provided residential accommodation but is now a cafe. By far York's most complete medieval gateway, Warngate Bar is the only one to have kept its outer defence or barbican intact. As we pass through the city walls, the barbican will be on our right-hand side, and you'll be able to look at it from a different angle. A fortified passageway with doors at either end, the barbican is a clever way of defending a medieval gateway. Warngate Bar is thought to retain the original wooden doors installed in the 1300s, but the outer barbican doors, made of iron, have long since disappeared. During the English Civil War, parliamentarian forces set up cannons on nearby Lamel Hill during the siege of 1644 and pounded the gateway, causing severe damage which was later repaired. Warngate Bar was also undermined, packed full of explosives by the besiegers, with the intention of creating a gap in the walls to gain access. The plot failed when the Royalist defenders found out what was happening and dug a separate mine to cut off the tunnel, filling it with water. Over the next few centuries, the side walls of the barbican became more ruinous, leading to the Estates Committee of 1831 suggesting the removal of the structure, a recommendation that was never carried out. Instead, the whole barbican was fully restored by York Corporation in 1840, using money they acquired from the Great North of England Railway Company. York's cattle market once dominated this area. Livestock markets had previously been held in the city streets, but in the 1820s, land was purchased here outside the city walls. The ditch that ran alongside the medieval walls was covered over, and pens were constructed to hold cattle and sheep. There was even a railway branch line to the market added in the late 1870s, allowing livestock to be transported to the site. Numerous public houses and hotels once existed nearby, all serving the many farmers and cattle buyers who came from far and wide to York. A handful of these pubs still survive today, such as the Phoenix inside the city walls, and the Edinburgh Arms, which we pass on our right. The City Arms, which we pass on the left, is now housing. It was originally a hotel built by York Corporation to serve the cattle market. Having been a major part of city life for over 100 years, the cattle market closed in the 1970s and moved to the York.
On the right, you can see an archway in the city walls known as Fisher Gate. Although first recorded in 1315, the current structure dates from 1487 and is one of 6 entrances in York city walls. In 1489, the gateway suffered considerable damage in the Yorkshire Rebellion against Henry VII's New Texas. Local peasants burned the gates of the bar. The uprising came just 4 years after Richard III had been defeated in Camden Hall of Bosworth. It may have been an indication of Henry VII's popularity in York. Fishergate Bar was reopened in the 1800s to provide better access when the cattle market moved to the area.
We will shortly be in the Fishergate area of the city, where the remains of wooden Anglo-Saxon buildings have been found, providing evidence of what would have been a very busy trading settlement. Writings from Anglo-Saxon times describe York as having trading links with northern Europe via the nearby rivers. Items found in this area show a variety of craft skills, with pieces of decorative iron and bone with stylized animal patterns, along with artifacts made from antler, leather, and glass. The River Foss, York's smallest river, flows to your left, towards the flood barrier, near where the Foss joins the bigger River Ouse. The floodgate in the Foss barrier was improved in 2021, but flooding remains a problem in York. We will shortly cross the River Ouse, which passes through the city centre and continues south, eventually joining the Humber and flowing out to the North Sea.
You will get wonderful views in both directions of our biggest river, the Ouse. Right is looking towards Ouse Bridge and the city centre. After crossing Skeldergate Bridge, a street called Skeldergate is on the right-hand side. Once a busy riverfront area bustling with activity. It was York's main dockside streets full of warehouses and other buildings. The city's wealth in medieval times was built on the river, used to export items such as wool, grain and cloth. A range of goods were also brought into the city's flourishing port, including wine and pottery from Europe. The city's merchants built guild halls on or near the rivers. But by the mid-1300s, the city's port was overtaken by Hull. Around the same time, York was hit by the Black Death of 1349, which killed an estimated 40% of the population. The city grew prosperous again afterwards, but gradually declined in importance as a port, although river trade continued into Victorian times.
We are now heading towards one of the city's old chocolate factories. Unlike other northern towns, York was not built on coal, steel and textiles, but on chocolate and the railways. At its height, the chocolate industry in York employed 14,000 people. The city had three important confections: Cravens, Rowntree's and Terry's. Cravens made hard-boiled sweets, French almonds and humbugs. They supplied all the big department stores up and down the country. Rowntree's created Kit Kats, Aeros and Smarties. As Terry's most famous product was a chocolate orange, made in the factory with all packs in a few minutes.
Rowntree's of York began in the city was closed in 1822. 40 years later, they expanded into chocolate. The longest running product from Rowntree's is the chocolate bean. This was launched in 1882. Its hard sugar shell meant that ladies wearing white gloves could eat them without any danger of getting melted chocolate on their gloves. Chocolate beans were renamed Smarties in 1935. The original tubes were round, and the lids with letters on first made an appearance in 1959, designed to improve children's literacy skills. The last Smarties to be made in York were in 2007. Colours are now all plant-based and derived from lemon, relish and red cabbage. Since 2008, Orange Smarties are unique to the UK. They are the only ones to have a flavoured shell, and that is thanks to orange oil. In 1881, Rowntree's produced crystallised gum pastilles. These were the first pastilles exported to France, and they really helped to turn around the fortunes of the Rowntree company. Today, fruit pastilles are still marketed under the Rowntree's name, even though they are made by Nestle. The factory in York still makes 32 million polos every day, and over 60 million Yorkie bars every year. It was in the 1930s that Rowntree's produced some of the biggest chocolate brands we know and enjoy today. Aero, the Black Magic chocolate assortment, and Kit Kat. The Kit Kat was launched in 1935 and is the world's most widely recognised confectionery logo, eaten in over 80 countries. 4 million Kit Kats are made every day in York. The largest consumer of Kit Kats is Japan, and this is because the name Kit Kat is similar to the Japanese phrase Kito Katsu, which means good luck, or you will succeed.
On the left side, behind some modern housing, is the former Terry's factory. This operated here between 1926 and 2005. This site has now been developed as a residential accommodation, known as the Chocolate Works. Keep looking to your left and you will catch a glimpse of the beautiful Art Deco building. The chocolate apple was launched here in 1926 and was made for 28 years, followed by the chocolate orange in 1932, which is now a staple stocking filler at Christmas time. At its height, this factory was producing 60 million chocolate oranges every year. When Terry's were owned by Colgate-Palmolive, they even tried a chocolate lemon in 1979. This wasn't very popular and was discontinued 3 years later. Have a good look at the clock, which is unique. It doesn't have numbers on its face, but letters. It says Terry, York, and was designed as an advertising feature because of its proximity to the racecourse. This clock was once known as the Kitchen Clock of York because the locals used to set their watches by it. After the factory closed in 2005, the clock stopped working. It was the last part of the site to be redeveloped, and the firm discovered that the mechanism had been removed. Much detective work was needed to track down replacement parts. It is a type known as a waiting train clock, which means that all the clocks on site were controlled by an electric impulse from the master clock. It was made by Gents of Leicester and restored recently by Smiths of Derby. The clock tower opens on occasional dates as a museum, but only on certain days, so please check and book in advance.
Racing in York can be traced as far back as the Roman period. Until the racecourse was created here, various open spaces throughout the city were being used to host the sport, including, in the early 1600s, the frozen River Ouse. The Knavesmire was chosen as a new site. Part of the marshy area here was drained and a circuit laid out, ready to host the first horse race in 1731. Yorkshire-born architect John Carr built the first grandstand in the 1750s, distinguishing York Racecourse as one of the sport's leading venues throughout the remainder of the century. In 1842, York Race Committee was formed to make changes, partly because of the rise of Doncaster as a venue, turning the course from a horseshoe shape to a circular track. They improved the standard of racing and introduced popular racing events like the Gimcrack Stakes and the forerunner of the modern Ebor Festival. New stands and other buildings were constructed over the next half-century to meet the needs of the increasing numbers of racegoers. In the modern era, York Racecourse has not only staged many spectacular races, but was also chosen to host Royal Ascot in 2005 and St Leger in 2006.
Field to the left is an area known as the Knavesmire. As well as being used by the locals in the past for grazing animals, the Knavesmire has also been used for entertainment. In the 1800s, this included cockfights and boxing, especially on race days. More recently, football and cricket leagues have used the area, while circuses and hot air ballooning have taken place. On Independence Day 1904, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show performed here. And in 1982, Pope John Paul II appeared at the racecourse in front of a crowd of almost 200,000 people.
Just off the Mount, the main road which closely follows the Roman road that led to York from Tadcaster. Under Roman law, bodies were forbidden to be buried within the boundaries of settlements for hygiene reasons, so cemeteries were generally located alongside major routes into towns. Children playing on Trentham Drive in the early 1950s discovered human bones and pottery, completely by chance. Archaeologists were commissioned and found 53 cremation graves and around 340 burials. An apparent lack of grave markers, coupled with the cemetery's location in marshy ground, suggests the cemetery contained the less wealthy members of Roman York. Pottery and coins show it had been in use between the 2nd and 4th centuries.
Tended to be concentrated alongside the major roads into settlements. The Roman road from York to Tadcaster crossed this area, known as the Mount. The number of Roman tombstones and other evidence found in the vicinity since at least the 1700s suggests the Mount was a popular place to be buried. Behind the buildings on the left is Driffield Terrace, where routine excavations by archaeologists in the early 2000s revealed over 80 Roman skeletons and 14 cremation burials. Many of the skeletons were found to have been decapitated. Decapitations were not exactly uncommon in Roman Britain, but to find close to 50 in such a small area was highly unusual. The majority of the skeletons found were adult males, under 45 years of age and slightly taller than the average adult male in Roman Britain. Just one of the skeletons found on the site was identified as female. Buried with care and over a period of a couple of centuries, many of the skeletons uncovered originated from outside Britain. Most had lived and died violently, judging by the large number of injuries found. One skeleton even had evidence of bite marks, perhaps from a lion or tiger. Some have suggested the burials may have been executed criminals or perhaps even soldiers. Others believe the injuries are proof that the skeletons were gladiators.
Ahead of us is the Tower of Micklegate Bar, the most important of York's 4 main medieval gateways, welcoming visitors from the south. The gateway's original name, Michelnith, means Great Street, and was the traditional ceremonial entrance for monarchs entering the city. Upon arrival at Micklegate Bar, kings and queens are required to touch the state sword, a custom dating back to Richard II in 1389. King Charles III and Queen Elizabeth II have both arrived in York this way. In September 1541, King Henry VIII and his queen, Catherine Howard, were meant to enter the city through Micklegate Bar, which was decorated for the occasion. However, the king came through Walmgate Bar instead, after being met outside the city by officials who begged the king's forgiveness for the Norse rebellion during the Pilgrimage of Grace.
Micklegate Bar in front of us also has the nickname Traitor's Gate, as it was frequently used to display the heads of traitors on spikes. The most notable head placed on the gateway was Richard, the Duke of York, during the Wars of the Roses. The Duke had a strong claim to the throne. 2 of his children would later become the Kings Edward IV and Richard III. But after the Lancastrian forces defeated the Yorkists at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, the Duke's head was stuck on a spike at Micklegate Bar and supposedly given a paper crown to mock him. Alongside was the head of one of his other sons. The Yorkists would later get revenge against their Lancastrian rivals. 3 months after the Duke's death, his son Edward led a decisive victory at the Battle of Towton in 1461, not far from York. The triumphant Edward, soon to be King Edward IV, took down the heads of his late father and brother, replacing them with those of his enemies on Micklegate Bar. The last 2 heads to appear on the gateway were those of William Connolly and James Maine, members of Bonnie Prince Charlie's army during the Jacobite Rebellion. They were executed in York in 1746, Their edge remained on Micklegate Bar for more than 7 years. On the brick wall to the left-hand side is a picture of a bright green insect, the rare tansy beetle almost unique to York. The picture was created by the renowned environmental street artist ATM. In real life, tansy beetles are only 1 centimetre long. A decline in their wetland habitats and the availability of the yellow tansy flowers they feed on mean they can be found along the banks of the River Ouse, but hardly anywhere else.
If you look to the right, you'll see 2 huge archways in the city walls. These were built to allow steam trains in and out of the city walls into York's first permanent station. Designed by architect George Townsend Andrews, it opened inside the city walls in January 1841. It was built for the York and North Midland Railway Company, chaired by George Hudson. Much of the land required by the railway company was owned by York Corporation, of which Hudson was a leading member. An agreement was reached between both parties, and permission was granted to pierce the city walls and rebuild them with arched entrances. The first in 1839 and the second one in 1845, when increased traffic led to the enlargement of the station. But as more lines opened to new destinations, the station was becoming congested. Through trains coming into York had to reverse out of the restricted site to continue their journeys. Finally, a new, bigger station was opened outside of the walls in 1877.
On the left is York Railway Station. The bus stop here allows you to explore the station area or catch buses and trains to other destinations. You can catch our coastliner bus nearby, which stops in York on its journeys between Leeds and the East Coast. Please ask your driver for more information. On opening in June 1877, York Railway Station was the largest in Britain, containing 13 platforms and built on a curve. The main centrepiece of the station was the 800-foot-long train shed roof, held above the platforms by rows of cast-iron columns. This station replaced an older York station within the city walls, which by the 1870s was struggling to cope with increased passenger numbers and becoming congested due to its location. The North Eastern Railway Company was to design this new station on your left, but it took 6 years. Benjamin Burley took over from Cotter, and he was in turn replaced by William Peachey. At various points in the station's history, remodelling has taken place, most notably the addition of the current footbridge and platform extensions in the 1930s. In more modern times, the track layout was simplified by British Rail in the run-up to mainline electrification at the start of the 1990s. The railways are a huge part of the city's heritage. When York became a major railway centre, it helped boost tourism and attracted heavy industry to the city for the first time. It was back in May 1839 when the first section of the city's railway was completed, from York to South Milford, about 15 miles away, moving from a temporary station that was soon replaced by York's old station within the city walls. By the middle of 1840, York was connected to London by rail. The journey between York and the capital could be made in as little as 14 hours. This was reduced to only 6 hours 10 minutes by 1848. York entered the industrial age with the arrival of the railways, becoming a centre for the repair and manufacture of carriages and engines. As early as 1839, small carriage repair shops had been established in nearby Queen Street, joined in a few years by a locomotive repair shop, where engines were also built later. Wagon shops were begun in 1865 and later extended into bigger premises in the 1880s, when the North Eastern Railway decided to concentrate more carriage construction in the city. By the end of the Victorian age, around 5,500 people worked in York's railway industry, one of the city's 2 biggest employers, along with confectionery.
On your left, the York Tap Public House forms part to York Railway Station's entrance. The area takes its name from the building which once housed the station tea room. Opened in around 1906, both the building's interior and furniture were designed in an Art Nouveau style popular at the time. This area has featured in several films, including Agatha, starring Vanessa Redgrave and Dustin Hoffman, The Dresser, starring Albert Finney, and it also appears at the end of Chariots of Fire.
On the right-hand side of the road is a small graveyard in a very odd place. There's no church or wall around it, and very few headstones still remain. There are estimated to be about 180 victims of cholera buried here after an outbreak in the 1830s. Due to fear of cholera spreading, the graves were dug here outside the city walls and before this area was developed during the railway age. Unfortunately, this didn't stop the cases of cholera, as it's not an airborne disease, but one spread through contaminated water. It was only later that York-born surgeon John Snow, working in Victorian London in the 1850s, discovered the link between cholera and dirty water when he identified a water pump as the source of an outbreak there. Entering the Memorial Gardens, where there is a bus stop close to the National Railway Museum. The War Memorial to the right was designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens and commemorates more than 1,000 servicemen from York who were killed fighting in the First World War. The city's annual service of remembrance is held here. The memorial was unveiled in 1925 by Prince Albert, Duke of York, who later became King George VI. Earlier, on the same day, the restored Five Sisters window in York Minster had been unveiled by the Duchess of York, honouring all the women of the British Empire who died during the conflict. York itself was attacked several times by Zeppelins during the First World War. An air raid in May 1916 led to 18 bombs being dropped on the city in the space of 10 minutes, leading to 9 deaths and 40 people being injured.
Against attacks from the river. Barker Tower was leased to various ferrymen who would transport passengers across the river, a business that ended after London Bridge was opened in 1863. The name Barker Tower comes from some connection with the tanners, who rented a nearby area known as Tanner's Moat. Tanners involved in the leather tanning industry were sometimes referred to as barkers because they used tree bark as a source of tannin in the production of leather. Now a cafe, Barker Tower was at one point also used as a mortuary.
The York Museum Gardens on the left has a wide selection of plant species and wildlife. It's a beautiful place for a picnic where you can spot birds and squirrels. The gardens are set against the backdrop of 3 wonderful ruins: St Leonard's Hospital, the Multangular Tower with part of the Roman fortress, and the remains of St Mary's Abbey. The land was granted in the 1830s to the Yorkshire Philosophical Society to construct a museum for its collections, on condition that they also established a botanical garden. Straight in front of you is York Minster. It is a short walk to our most famous building from the next bus stop. Ahead you can see the Minster's west window, nicknamed the Heart of Yorkshire due to the shape within the stonework of the window. To the lower right of the window is one of the newest additions to the Minster, the statue of Queen Elizabeth II, unveiled by King Charles III in 2022.
This brings us us into Exhibition Square, a great stop for city centre attractions, with the York Art Gallery on your left and the way onto the city walls on your right. This is also the closest stop for York Minster, which is just through the archway on your right, beneath the city walls staircase. It's a short walk back to the shops, cafes and pubs from here too. Thank you to anyone leaving us at this point. We hope that you have enjoyed your tour with York City Sightseeing. You can continue to use your tickets during the 24-hour period from when you first bought it, so please do hop back on later if we can take you anywhere on the route. We hope you will join us again, here or at any of our other destinations worldwide.
Welcome aboard if you're just joining us.